Hey, what's up, folks? Jorge Anito here. Thanks for stopping by. Welcome back. Today, we have a really cool passage that we're looking at in Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 20. It's a story about a demon-possessed guy who runs around naked, lives in a graveyard, and cuts himself and tortures the nearby people, the townspeople, the people who live in the region. This passage is really bizarre, and it's a little unsettling and unnerving, because when you read through the Gospels, you read through the Bible, and you see these encounters with demon-possessed people, they're often intense, but they're not as intense as this specific story. This is the most extreme account of demonic possession that I know of in the Gospels. And it comes to us in three different places. We're reading Mark's account. It's also found in Matthew and in Luke. So in Matthew chapter 8 and in Luke chapter 8, you can find the same account. And Matthew and Luke add different details. It's the same account, but they add a couple things that Mark doesn't add, and we'll look at what they have to say as well. But demonic spirits, they are a reality no matter what we think. And so looking at this text, we're going to see that there are two powers at work in the world. Dark forces being one of them, and the power of God being the other. This is the story about the guy who's possessed with a legion of demons. And so when we read some of these demonic possessions, it's often one unclean spirit or one demon that enters into a person, even kids. But this occasion, it's many demons, and we'll look at that. Okay, so, of the many wonderful stories and testimonies in the Bible, this one does stand out because, like I said, the content is so bizarre. And it reveals how far demons go to afflict harm on God's children. And it shows how dangerous it is to be held captive to the enemy. It looks like something right out of a horror film because it indeed is horrific. It's a vulgar display of power, but eclipsing that is the mercy of God to bring about restoration and deliverance to a troubled soul. The reason I chose to look at Mark's account is simply because it's the longest of the three accounts. It's 20 verses, which isn't too long, but it is the longest of the three. Like I said, we'll consider some other things that Matthew and Luke add as well. Just a quick note about Mark's gospel. It seems that the majority of Mark's gospel is written to Gentiles. When you read the Bible, you read about these two groups, the Jews and the Gentiles. The Gentiles are basically anyone other than a Jew. So I would be considered a Gentile. And so when Mark writes his gospel, he explains a lot of Jewish terms and customs, which would be familiar to a Jewish audience. And so what that indicates is that it seems as if he has a Gentile audience in mind, though I'm sure Jewish people were a part of that as well. But anyway, let's start reading at chapter 5, verses 1 through 20. I'll be reading out of the New American Standard Bible. And so starting at verse 1, and they, Jesus and the disciples, and they came to the other side of the sea, into the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had come out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. And he had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one was able to bind him any more, even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. And constantly, day and night, among the tombs and in the mountains, he was crying out and gashing himself with stones. And seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What do I have to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you, by God, do not torment me." For he had been saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And he was asking him, "What is your name?" And he said to Jesus, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he began to entreat Jesus earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there was a big herd of swine feeding there on the mountain. And the demons entreated Jesus, saying, "Send us into the swine so that we may enter them." And he gave them permission, and coming out, the unclean spirits entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, about 2,000 of them, and they were drowned in the sea. And their herdsmen ran away and reported it in the city and out in the country, and the people came to see what it was that had happened. And they had came to Jesus and observed the man who had been demon-possessed sitting down, clothed, and in his right mind, the very man who had had the legion. And they became frightened. And those who had seen it described to them how it had happened to the demon-possessed man and all about the swine. And they began to entreat Jesus to depart from their region. And as he was getting into the boat to leave, the man who had been demon-possessed was entreating him that he might accompany him. Jesus did not let him, but he said to him, "Go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you." And the man went away and began to proclaim in Decapolis what great things Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. What makes this account so strange is how the enemy chose to operate. We usually see, the enemy coming as an angel of light, sitting in the church pews, breeding division, whispering temptations, and breeding doubt. He's crafty, he's sneaky, and he's subtle. Consider the serpent in Genesis chapter 1, how he was crafty and subtle. But even though we're dealing with a legion of demons, obviously, Satan is the commander-in-chief, but dark forces usually take, it seems like, a more incognito approach to their attacks. This scenario, this scene that we just read is altogether different. Because this occasion, as I stated earlier, is a vulgar display of demonic power. This is not typical of the enemy. Who knows how long this man was possessed? But this guy serves as a portrait of pure evil, pure terror. And the enemy demonstrated his power through this poor soul. And to the people who lived in this region, this guy was a monster. Now, we're talking about a demon-possessed man, but there were actually two of them, two guys. You can read about that in Matthew chapter 8, verse 28. Luke says that for a long time, this man, he wore no clothes. I'm guessing both guys ran around naked. I'm not sure. But in Mark, as we read, once Jesus restored him, when the townspeople came out, he was clothed and in his right mind. So, and Luke also says they lived neither in a house, but they lived among the tombs. They lived in this graveyard, and it says that the demon would drive them into these solitary places, and they would cut themselves with these sharp stones. They were so violent that no one could pass by that way. That's what Matthew says. At least one of them was so powerful that when the demon seized him, that he broke the chains to his hands and feet, because he was kept under guard from the townspeople. But he would just break these chains, he would break these irons, And like I said, he was driven by the demon into these solitary places up in the mountains and mainly among the tombs. And so just showing like the power of demonic forces in these guys. One, they give unnatural strength. You know, they was binded with chains and they would just break them and wreak havoc on passersby. They would, the demonic power, they cause self-harm by mutilation, self-mutilation. This guy was cutting himself. He was tormented, just extreme mental anguish, because the text reads that he cried out day and night in the hills. And he was a sexual deviant, in my opinion, lewd, because it was shameful back then, even today, obviously, to expose oneself publicly. You know, that's a serious charge. And so this guy's running around naked, which is a disgraceful thing nowadays, even more so back then. And it was just a sign of lewdness and just antisocial behavior. He lived among the dead. He dwelt among the tombs. He lived in a graveyard. These two guys, we read about the one guy in Mark because Mark chooses to focus on him. Maybe he was the dominant one or whatever. But they were more comfortable living among the dead than they were living among the living, And so we would refer to these type of people as social outcasts, maniacs, psychotic, sadistic. And so Jesus asked him what his name. He says, we are legion because we are many. That word legion refers to, it's a Greek word that refers to a Roman detachment of soldiers. And it could be anywhere from 400 to a few thousand soldiers. And so this was a lot of demons that had entered into this guy. And so Jesus comes on the scene and everything changes. I jumped ahead and started saying stuff that Jesus asked him what his name was, but let's go back for just a minute. But Jesus comes on the scene, and when the demons recognize Jesus, look at what they do in verse 6 and 7. And seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, what do I have to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you, by God, do not torment me. That phrase, what have I to do with you? In the NASB, they translate it as, what have you to do with me? That sounds kind of weird, but it's a phrase that sort of has the same meaning as what we would say nowadays as, this town's not big enough for the two of us. It was a confronting sort of statement. Now here's the thing. They say, what do we have to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Most everyone in the Bible, especially the Gospels, refer to Jesus as the Son of David. And the reason they do that is because of his bloodline and his messianic lineage to the Davidic dynasty. The king, God promised that the Messiah would come through the lineage of King David. And so they refer to Jesus as the Son of David. Jesus would often refer to himself as the Son of Man, which is a reference to his humanity. We often focus on his divinity, but Jesus has two natures. He is divine and he's human. But when he calls himself the Son of Man, it's also a reference back to the Old Testament prophecy of Daniel, referring to the Son of Man coming on the clouds of glory. And so Jesus would refer to himself as the Son of Man. Now, both of these terms are accurate titles to describe Jesus, Son of David, Son of Man. But the demons neither called him Son of Man nor Son of David, but they cried out, Jesus, Son of the Most High God. This is the most accurate title for Jesus, Son of the Most High God. The only other way, or the only other person that would later say something similar about Jesus was Peter. Whenever Jesus asked the disciples at Caesarea Philippi, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter answers, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." That's similar, but the point is that the demons, they fully understand the deity of Christ, his divine nature, and they bow at his authority. The text actually reads that when the man saw Jesus from a distance, he came up running, and he fell on his knees before him. Dark forces can do nothing but bow before Christ and glorify him. We read about that also in Mark chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. And James says later on in the gospel, the book of James, in chapter 2, verse 19, James is writing to a church and he says, "You believe that there is one God? That's good. But even the demons believe, but at least they tremble." Many Christians today, as back then, they believe in God, but they don't fear him. God is to be revered. He is to be feared, not in the sense that we may think of being afraid or something like that, but in the sense that we should present this sort of awe, this reverence, this recognition that we are in, that God is so much greater than we are. He is to be respected and honored, and God will not be mocked. The Bible says that. But listen to what else the demons say. They say, talking to Jesus, "I beg you, by God's name, don't torture us." Matthew includes another detail, something else that they cried out along with what we just read in Mark. Matthew records them saying, "Have you come to torture us before the appointed time?" They know that there is a set time when God will judge his creation. A set time known only by the Father, when each created being will rise for judgment and stand before a holy and live God, and their fate will be exacted. Luke adds another detail that they said, and Luke adds, they were begging Jesus not to command them to go to the abyss. That's in Luke chapter 8, verse 31. The King James Version calls the abyss the deep, but it's the Greek word abyssos, which is the abyss. And it basically means a bottomless pit, but it has deeper meaning than just a bottomless pit. It wasn't necessarily hell, but it was this dark, chaotic place where just darkness lived. In Greek mythology, that's what it was. And for whatever reason, Luke chooses to add this detail in his account of the demons saying, "Don't send us into the abyss." Matthew says, don't torture us before the appointed time, and don't send us to the abyss. Now, this is a pit that's dedicated to the most heinous of spiritual beings. And it could be, possibly, the same thing as Tartarus, which we read in 2 Peter 2 and 4, in Jude verses 6, and in 1 Peter chapter 3 verses 19 through 20. Jude verse 6 says, "And the angels who did not keep their proper positions of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, these entities God has in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day." Now I'm going to read what 2 Peter says. 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 4. And it talks about God taking these spiritual beings who sinned in the days of Noah back in Genesis 6. when it talks about the sons of God looking on the daughters of men and taking wives and transgressing boundaries, doing what they ought not do. And so Peter says in the second chapter, verse 4, "For God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell," which is the word Tartarus, this 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 pit, this place, this prison. "For God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus, and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment." In 1 Peter, that was in 2 Peter, in his first letter, he's talking about Christ and, when he was crucified, he was dead in the flesh, but alive in the spirit. And in chapter 3, verses 19, he said he was made alive in the spirit, in which he also went and preached or made proclamation to the spirits in prison, who were disobedient when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark, when just a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. And they're referring to these divine beings who sinned, and that God has reserved for judgment in this place, this dark prison, this hole, whatever it is. And he doesn't do that with all these entities. It's just certain ones. That's obviously the case because we read about all these other demons that's present in the Gospels. But the point that I'm making is that this legion of demons that we're reading about, they have a proper theology. They recognize the deity in God's Son, and they bow in reverence. They know of an appointed time for the great day of judgment, and they are aware of this abyss, this dark pit where some of their comrades are incarcerated awaiting judgment. And they beg Jesus for mercy. Oddly enough, these 2 men that the demons possessed, these 2 guys who were demon possessed, their well-being wasn't considered. These demons were intent on inflicting as much destruction as possible on these men and the surrounding people of that area. And now they want to plead to God for mercy, to have mercy on them. Now Jesus asked the demons to identify itself. Remember that names are very important back in those times. They are today, but even more so back then. A name carried a lot of meaning and significance for people, and for angels alike. In this case, these fallen entities. So they confess their name as Legion, for we are many. And as I explained earlier, this term refers to a regiment, a dispatchment of warriors on a mission to destroy. And in New Testament times, a Roman legion or a Roman regiment of soldiers, it was about upwards of 6,000. Anywhere from a few hundred to upwards of 6,000 soldiers, cavalry, horseback riders, commanders, leaders, infantry, foot soldiers. And so Legion is a name that carries order, the connotation of order and subordination. They were subordinate to Satan, but there are ranks and positions of authority, assignments within their own dispatchment. And their purpose is simply to seek and destroy. And they are also territorial. But they submit their name to Jesus, and they start negotiating with Jesus. We've already established the fact that they don't want to go where their buddies are in the abyss, awaiting trial, and they don't want to be tortured before the set appointed time. Because God has this set time, and He won't deviate from that, and they know that. they have caused so much harm to this region for who knows how long, and they've manifested so much evil, and now they stand in the presence of pure holiness, confronted by the glory of God and the power of Christ. And they realize that they're about to get dealt with real quick. They look around. First thing they see is a herd of pigs. Send us among the pigs. Jesus gives them permission, and the demons exit the two men, and they enter into the pigs. About 2,000 pigs, to be exact, the text reads, to where the swine, out of madness, with a legion of demons coursing through them, barrels down a hill, off a cliff, and into the sea, and they're drowned. Not sure why Jesus would permit the demons to go into the pigs. I don't want to obviously interpret anything that's not really present in the text, but at best I want to offer some conjecture and speculation. The region that they're in, the region of the Gerasenes, this is Gentile country. And this is the first time that Jesus, with his disciples, visit Gentile territory. And they are met with hostile forces. Pigs themselves are unclean animals, not to be eaten by Jewish people. It was a dietary law in the Mosaic law. And so demons are unclean spirits. So I guess it's fitting or appropriate for unclean spirits to enter unclean animals. Who knows? But another side note is that Gentiles had their own gods that they had sacrificed pigs to. And so that would be a forbidden thing for a Jew to sacrifice an unclean animal. So a possible theological implication might be that Jesus could have been saying to the folks in this region symbolically, trying to relay the idea of, this sacrifice that they do of pigs is ultimately going to be eclipsed by Christ, the one true sacrifice, to end all sacrifices for Jews and Gentiles. But that's just my own thoughts, and there's a lot more that could be said about that. But I'm going to move on. Anyway, verse 14 and 15 talk about the herdsmen, the people tending the pigs. They ran and told the townspeople and the people in the country what had happened. And the townspeople come out to the area, and they see these men who were demon-possessed, sitting down, clothed. They have clothes on now, and they're in their right mind. And they hear how Jesus delivered these guys, and they beg Jesus to leave. You would think they would beg him to stay, but they beg him to leave. They may have been upset that they had lost all those pigs in the sea. That's a lot of bacon and pork chops. That was a livelihood, for those people. They just lost a lot of money when that happened. But the Bible doesn't say that they were mad about that, but Luke records that they were overcome with fear. All they have ever known was these two demon-possessed men wreaking havoc on passers-by and wreaking havoc on that area, living among the tombs, howling at the moon at night, cutting on themselves. And all of a sudden, these guys are normal people now in their right minds. And the townspeople realize that Jesus possesses a greater power than the vast evil power they had witnessed in these two guys for oh so long. And they were afraid, and they pled with Jesus to go. They were more comfortable living in darkness or with darkness rather than the light. It's something that they had just become complacent. They had at one time tried to bind the guys with shackles and chains. They broke free, and they're just to a place where there's nothing they can do with it. They know of these demon-possessed men, and they just stay away from them. But then when Jesus comes and restores them, that sort of disrupts the flow. Yeah, it's a good thing, but these guys were so powerful, and you restored them. Jesus is obviously, greater in power, but isn't it similar to our present time? How the world around us is more comfortable living in sin and darkness, and you try to tell people about Christ, but they don't want to hear about that. That would disrupt their lives. People are more comfortable living in darkness than living in the light, but God will continue to work on people and to draw close to everyone until the light finally goes off and they realize, I need Jesus. I need a Savior. I need to be reconciled to God. Or either they simply, reject Him and continue to reject God's offer. But that's where we as Christians have to stand firm in the faith and be an example of light among those living in darkness. Now we get to the last place in our text. The people are begging Jesus to leave, and he's a gentleman. He's going to leave. He gets into the boat, but the guy in verse 18 and 19 who was healed begs Jesus, hey, let me accompany you. Let me go with you. He's excited. Jesus says, no, I have a ministry for you. And so in verse 18, we read, sorry about that, I lost my place. Must have took out my marker. So, okay. Jesus tells him, he didn't let him get in the boat, but he said to him, go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you. And the guy went away and began to proclaim in Decapolis what great things Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. Jesus had a ministry for this guy, and he told him to go and share his story with his family and friends. And Jesus says, tell how much the Lord has done for you. If we read Luke, it says basically the same thing, but Jesus tells him, go and tell everybody what God has done for you. But what we read in the verse following is the guy goes around and tells everybody what Jesus has done for him. So he's making the connection, between God and Jesus. He's making that divine connection. Jesus says, go tell everybody what God did for you. He goes and tells everybody what Jesus did for him. So he makes that connection. And he went to Decapolis, the text reads, which is 10 cities. It's 10 Greek cities, and they're close together. It's sort of like a tri-state, a tri-city area. But it's this huge metropolis, this huge area, big business, a lot of commercial, a bunch of people. This guy went around telling everyone what Jesus did for him. That was his God-given ministry, to go and give his testimony, to tell his story. Mark says one last thing about this. It says that everybody he told, they marveled. They were amazed. He spread the word about Jesus, and it caught people's attention. How can this crazy, psychotic maniac now be normal? It's only because of Jesus. And so in conclusion, it's a great story, but does it have application for our lives? How is this relevant to us? This passage, among many others in the Bible, illustrates the impact and the importance of testimonies. Our personal stories about God's power in our lives are important, and people need to hear that. How he saved us, how he stood us on our feet and moved us along our way, and how he transformed our lives. We each have a story to tell. Consider this man who was demon-possessed, tormented, running around naked, living in the cemetery, and everyone knew him. They knew to stay away from him, but they knew him. Until the Son of God confronts him, and the power of Jesus sweeps him off his feet, The Lord restores his sanity, and the Lord broke the chains of darkness that had bound him, and the Lord touches this man's heart, and he saves him from his sin. God completely transforms this guy, and what does he do? He has a story to tell, instructed by Jesus, and he goes and tells his story. And the Bible says everyone was amazed. We too have stories to tell. Our stories may not be like this particular guy's, but our stories nonetheless are just as meaningful and valuable because we've witnessed the power of God's transformation in and through our lives and in the lives of others. The Bible says in 1 Peter chapter 3:15, sanctify Christ in your hearts, always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that's in you, and yet do it with gentleness and respect. Revelation 12:11 says that we are overcomers by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of our testimony. Jesus is the word of our testimony. He is the object of our faith, and he's at the center of our story. God uses our stories to impact people, and people usually respond in at least three ways. They can either reject it, accept it, or they want to hear more. And so, our stories act as a ministry platform for more opportunities to witness to them. It's almost like pre-evangelism. It's a little difficult bumping into somebody on the street and automatically teaching them, doctrines and theology. It's easier to start by telling our stories, which really are Jesus' stories, and building relationships and building trust with others and being transparent. That's where the seed is planted. It's all about God reconciling people to himself through his son, Jesus, and his work on the cross. I'm thankful for my story about how he saved me from a world of sin. A low-life drug addict, I had a blackened heart, without morals, and God stepped in, picked me up, stood me on my feet, and, sent me on my way. Someone needs to hear our stories. Our testimonies are powerful because they all point to the one true power, the only one who has the true power to save. Thank you for listening to me. We're almost 38 minutes in. Thank you for sitting this one out, and God bless.